very much for having me here today. I just get settled a little bit to share some of my research on surrogacy. So usually when I talk about my research, I'm talking to other academics, or I'm talking to researchers, or I'm talking to students. And when I do that, I first have to give a pretty, what we would think of as a pretty basic explanation of surrogacy and what surrogacy is. For as you know, most people do not truly understand surrogacy. The differences between traditional and gestational, between agency and indie journeys, what IPs are, what compensation, how it's structured, the legality of surrogacy, and the various medical procedures involved. And this, I think, is really part of the story of surrogacy in the contemporary United States. Most people outside of the world of surrogacy have heard of it, and they think they understand it, but there are some real basic cultural misconceptions about the practice. And I think that these misconceptions have had a really profound influence on how surrogacy is structured, how it's organized, how it's practiced, and how people then experience surrogacy. So before I jump into talking about my research for my book, I'd like to explain a little bit about who I am and the work that I do and how I came to study surrogacy. So as was given in my introduction, I'm a family sociologist and I work at the University of Texas at Arlington, just down the road in Arlington. I'm a qualitative sociologist, and what that basically means is that I collect my own data for research by talking to people, by interviewing them, by spending time with them. So what I'm most interested in is understanding people's lives, people's experiences from their own perspective. I'm interested in the various routes to family formation in our country and the experiences that people have on those different routes. So my first book was on international adoption. For that project, I interviewed adoptive parents and professionals who work in the field of adoption about the pressure that adoptive parents experience, international adoptive parents experience, about educating their children and keeping their adopted children connected to the cultures of birth, of their birth countries. So when I finished up that project, I loved that project, and that was my first book called Culture Keeping. When I finished up that project, I realized that I was really interested in hearing from people and understanding the experiences of people who assist others to become parents. And so I think, perhaps you might agree with me, naturally turned to surrogacy. And this project culminated in the recent book, Labor of Love, Gestational Surrogacy and the Work of Making Babies, which was published by Rutgers University Press just a couple months ago in March of this year. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here to talk about my just released book. And so let me come back to those basic misconceptions about surrogacy. So I don't doubt that many of you have run into these misconceptions. Many of you who are surrogates yourselves, or who work in this field of surrogacy, have run into these basic misconceptions of surrogacy. So I'm probably not going to tell you anything new here about what those basic misconceptions are. But what I do hope to add to the dialogue is a sociological understanding of how those misconceptions have structured the practice of surrogacy in the United States, and therefore the experiences that perhaps you might have and other people might have working as surrogates or surrogacy professionals, or using surrogates as a route to parenthood. I should say using surrogacy, not using surrogates. So I see three basic misconceptions, three basic cultural misconceptions about surrogacy in the United States, kind of the general US population when thinking about surrogacy. And the first is one that perhaps you have run into, is the misconception that surrogates are parting with their own children. So surrogates who I interviewed for my study told me that they often confronted people who assumed that they had had sexual intercourse with someone else's husband, or that they were artificially inseminated with someone else's sperm and were using their own egg, right? And were therefore parting with their own genetic and biological children. And indeed, we do have surrogates, as you know. We have traditional surrogates who for whom that is the case. But I was interviewing gestational surrogates, which is the majority of surrogates today in our country are gestational surrogates. So who were confronted with this basic misconception. So what many people told me, and perhaps you have done this as well, many people told me they engage in these mini education sessions with people, with their family members, with friends, with strangers, that they meet in public to contradict this misconception, right? To deal with this. And this often begins with a very, very basic lesson in biology, right? To correct the misunderstandings of surrogacy procedures. So according to the National Science Foundation, many citizens do not have a firm grasp of basic scientific facts and concepts in our country, unfortunately. Less than 30% of the US population is thought to be scientifically literate, which of course means 70% of the US population is not scientifically literate. So as Michael Klimowski and his colleagues tell us, the majority of the US population displays a profound, he says, quote, a profound ignorance of and often misinformation about matters biological. So the surrogates in my study confronted this ignorance about reproduction, about IVF, what IVF is, that it's possible, yes, it is, right? And advanced medical procedures when their surrogate status became known. So the surrogates who spoke to me told me that they spend a good deal of energy dispelling the misconception that they are the genetic mother through either sexual intercourse or artificial insemination of the surrobaby that they are carrying. And they did so by using very basic language about biology and genetics, emphasizing that the babies are not theirs because they do not contribute their own eggs in the process. So these women told me that that the concept of third-party reproduction, that women can gestate fetuses without contributing their own eggs, was brand new to many people. Was a brand new world for many people, and because of this, the women I spoke to used very basic language when explaining the medical process. So, for example, they would tell people, "I'm basically the oven." So you take her egg and you take his sperm and you make a baby in the lab, and there you go, right? It's very simple. So that's the first basic misconception about gestational surrogacy and how it shapes the experiences of women as surrogates. This misconception also shapes how people talk about surrogacy, the terms that have become common in surrogacy, and the language we use to name things. So for example, we talk about intended parents, right? Because intention is such an important part of surrogacy. We use the phrase giving the babies back, right? Instead of giving the babies away. Right? Because the understanding is, of course, that the babies never were the surrogates' babies, but always were the intended parents. And this is true, of course, for traditional surrogates as well, that idea, that concept. So the second basic misconception about surrogacy is that everyone has the same pregnancy and birthing experience. And that pregnancy and birth hold no pleasure in and of themselves, and are painful, unpleasant experiences best avoided, unless you really, really want a baby, right? And so, so surrogacy doesn't make sense to people, because why would you possibly want to get pregnant and carry someone else's baby, right? So with these two basic misconceptions in place, surrogacy is often framed as morally suspect and as illogical. Right? So people cannot understand why a woman would want to give away her own baby and why she would want to be pregnant and give birth, because isn't pregnancy and birth just completely awful? Right? So this brings us to the basic third misconception people have about surrogacy. And that is that people do not engage in painful, immoral behavior for the benefit of others unless they are pressured to do so. So surrogacy only makes sense from this perspective. If people have those two basic misconceptions about surrogacy, surrogacy will only make sense to them if women are pressured to become surrogates. If they're coerced to become a surrogate by their own greed by someone else's greed, or by their own desperate needs. And this is why so many people in the US focus on compensation and talk about compensation and are interested in hearing about compensation, I would argue. So these three basic misconceptions have shaped how surrogacy is therefore organized in the United States. These misconceptions profoundly influence the people's interest in surrogacy. One of the things that people outside of the world of surrogacy are always interested in, of course, is compensation. So when I first began my research, I was initially interested, as many people are, in the motivations that bring women to bear children for others. I didn't have those misconceptions, but I was still interested in that as a sociologist. However, once I began spending time with surrogates, I became increasingly fascinated in what I came to realize was a quite complex and laborious process that is largely enacted and often managed by surrogates themselves. So my book is the result of that interest, focusing on the work that surrogates engage in and how they and others understand that labor within a society that has those basic misconceptions about surrogacy, within the society in which these arrangements as well have a pretty contentious history. So my research is based on interviews with surrogates, with surrogacy professionals, with intended parents, and with family members of surrogates. So over the course of really about 3 years, I followed individual surrogates on their journeys and intended parents. Sometimes I followed them on several journeys over the course of those 3 years. I performed multiple interviews with people and followed up via emails and phone calls and by reading people's blogs and their website postings. So during interview collection, I also spent time in the offices of lawyers and a reproductive endocrinologist, in surrogacy agencies, and in the homes of surrogate caseworkers, having the opportunity to witness some of the daily workings of surrogacy professionals. So, as I said, when I first began the project, I was immediately struck by the amount of labor and time surrogates invest in these arrangements. So, as you know, this work involves following and keeping track of a pretty complex medical protocol, undergoing a range of medical testing and procedures, attending numerous medical appointments, rearranging family schedules to accommodate surrogate work, attending surrogate support meetings, which are mandatory for some surrogates, staying in contact with their IPs, visiting their IPs, explaining procedures and providing emotional support to their IPs, as well as giving birth, right? And the emotional labor of managing the surrogate IP relationship. Many surrogates also invest considerable time in surrogate networks, including online support websites, and attending functions such as this one. So I was struck by all of this labor. But what I found was that talking with people about the work of surrogacy, about surrogacy as work, right, was a very tricky thing. So this is the complicated terrain of surrogacy that I wanted to explore in my book. So what I'd like to do today is to share with you some of the main findings from my book, and then have a dialogue about them, have a question and answer and a discussion about them. I would love to hear your thoughts. So as you know, surrogates are not official employees of either their agencies or their IPs, right? This is explicitly written into the contracts of many surrogacy arrangements. So when discussing surrogacy as work, I'm not talking about that kind of employment. I'm talking about that employment, right? I'm not talking about legal paid employment, but I'm talking about the experience of this labor, right? And the contested ideological terrain of how surrogacy is framed. Though surrogates are not legal employees, the experience of surrogacy is like paid employment in many ways. As a qualitative sociologist, we often do these comparisons, and I found this really helpful when I was thinking about surrogacy. So in what ways is surrogacy like work? In what ways is it not like work? So one of the most striking ways that surrogacy is like work in the 21st century United States is in the time demands. Surrogates in my study spoke to me about surrogacy being all-encompassing. One woman told me that to be a surrogate, she said, you really have to have the right motivation because there's no sick days, there's no days off, it's 24/7 once you get pregnant. So you hear the language, she's using the language of work, right? Sick days, days off, once you get pregnant. She added, then just all the shots and the medicines, people are really counting on you and you can't be flaky about taking your medicines. In this way too, in the fact that people are counting on you, right? People are depending upon you to complete this journey. Surrogacy is like employment. So most of the women in my study took their surrogacy work very seriously. The agencies did so as well. And this shaped the experiences that people have working as surrogates. Many of the women in my study spoke of working for agencies, though they were not legal employees. They spoke of being monitored in a work-like sense by agency employees. They spoke of needing to toe the line and of the possibility of quote-unquote getting fired. I heard that quite a bit, right? If they did not. They spoke of the sacrifices that they made in order to abide by the arrangements of surrogacy, especially the medical protocol and the doctor's appointments. So these sacrifices as well are part of what makes surrogacy like work. But it's not only the women themselves who sacrifice time and the ability to participate in regular activities, but as the women I spoke to for my study told me, and they consistently pointed this out to me, their children and their husbands sacrifice as well. Surrogacy, they contended and shared with me, takes over their family life because it takes over their lives. They spoke a good deal about the sacrifices that their husbands or partners made and that their children make in order for themselves to be able to engage in surrogacy. Indeed, the surrogates in my study spoke about the contribution of their families, their family members, so much, to such a degree that I spend a whole chapter in the book talking about the family work of surrogacy. So surrogacy mirrors paid employment, so again back to that comparison. Surrogacy mirrors paid employment in its time demands, in its responsibilities, in its pressures to perform, in its monitoring by supervisors, and in work-family conflict. Many of the women in my study expressed to me, however, explicitly that they did not want to think about surrogacy as work. And actually, perhaps as many of you, maybe some of you might be feeling right now, were completely offended, right, by this language, right, of talking about surrogacy as work and saying the two words in the same sentence, right? So I had to learn how to, as a sociologist, I wasn't coming at it, right? I'm interested in learning about people's experiences from their own perspective, right? But I saw all of this labor, and I was interested in talking to people about the labor, the work that they do. It's really hard to talk about the work without using the word work, right? So yes. So women were very explicit with me that they did not want to talk about this as work or think about it as work. And I think this is something that's really interesting. So this is what my book centers on. Something I'd really be interested in having a dialogue with you as well after I talk. So, and I argue in the book that it's not just surrogates themselves, but all of the different players in surrogacy. So surrogates, their family members, surrogacy professionals, the intended parents, everyone is really invested in this idea of not thinking about surrogacy as work. The language that we use, how we structure arrangements, all in effect obscure the tremendous amount of work that surrogates actually engage in. And this becomes most apparent when the most obvious work surrogacy issue, and also its most contentious, is discussed. And that, of course, is compensation. There were several women in my study who told me that their primary motivation for looking into surrogacy was money. However, the overwhelming majority were very explicit with me that they were not involved in surrogacy for the compensation. And this is a really important distinction within the rhetoric surrounding surrogacy, that these arrangements are not entered into because of financial need, because of monetary greed, but out of a desire to help others. So surrogates have received a lot of negative press about their labor, so much so that I was very thankful and grateful that surrogates were actually willing to talk with me, right, about this. And I found most women very careful about avoiding any inkling of money greed. And this is important to agencies as well. The importance of effectively communicating this idea shapes one of the standard rules, as I call it, the standard rules of surrogacy agencies in the US for selecting surrogates. And that is that women cannot be on government aid to work as surrogates. So those involved in surrogacy avoid framing surrogacy labor as work because the fear is that this would reduce it to reproductive exploitation. It would reduce it to baby selling. And it would give opponents to surrogacy fodder, right? It would give them ammunition against surrogacy. So it was very hard to talk, in my study, to talk with people about the work of surrogacy, with all of the labor that's involved, because just the language itself has been used against surrogacy. Right? The language of thinking about surrogacy as a laborious process, right? As involving work has been used against surrogacy. Right? So in making the argument that surrogates are not motivated by money, surrogates purport that financial need is not present, as would be in a normal work situation. This was an important factor to most of my participants, the fact that they didn't need to do surrogacy, right? And many people, as perhaps you have yourself, or have heard others say, if I worked at Walmart full-time for a year, I would have made more money. If I had done this, right? If I parse it out by hour, right? And all of that is about this basic misconception, right? This basic misconception of why people do surrogacy. For most of my women, the women in my study, then work is not something that you want to do. Right? They make this distinction between surrogacy and work is something that you don't want to do when you only do for money. Right? And surrogacy is not work because they do it for other reasons and not for the money. Surrogacy is also not work because of the deep pleasure and satisfaction surrogates derive from it. In discussing the pleasure of surrogacy that surrogates experience, the basic misconception that all pregnancy and birth is unpleasant is often seen. So when I talk about my research, and I mention to people, or when people read about it in my book, that women by and large seem to love their work as surrogacy, that they derive a great deal of satisfaction and pleasure from these experiences. Perhaps you've experienced this as well. I mean, people are just completely shocked, right, and awestruck by this. People often express just complete surprise and sometimes extreme shock, right? So the women in my study, which always kind of surprises me, because not everyone has the same birthing and pregnancy experience, right? But it's a basic misconception. So the women in my study told me that they experience so much pleasure, in fact, from surrogacy, that they often expressed guilt over working as a surrogate, and especially about receiving compensation. I had several women in my study say, I would do this 100 times if I could. I would do this for free if I could, right? I love doing this. Of course, not all surrogates feel that way, right? There's diversity among surrogates just as there's diversity among everyone else, right? In their experiences. But the guilt, especially in light of surrogate labor taking them away from their families, that's especially where the guilt came up. So surrogacy, they told me, was a selfish pursuit. Okay? Not done because of financial need, not done because of exploitation or monetary greed, but out of a desire for the experience. So they largely justified compensation, therefore, by using it on their families, especially their own children. The women in my study use their compensation to pay their monthly bills or to pay off a large bill, sometimes a vehicle note. But many used at least part of it, part of that money splurging on something special for their kids, right? Like a trip to Disney World, or putting it in a college account. So using the compensation on their families also seems to take it out of the realm of payment for service and into the realm of thank you gift for sacrifice. And this is ultimately how most of the surrogates that I spoke to wanted surrogacy framed as an enjoyable experience for themselves, and yet as a sacrifice that they and their families made to help others. So they wanted their labor acknowledged, right, but not acknowledged as work. So it's very complicated. They wanted compensation, right, and they wanted it to serve as just that, right, as compensation, as a thank you gift, right, for sacrifice, not payment for their services, not payment for the baby, not wages for their labor. So one of the agencies I spent time in actually spoke with me. They insisted that all of their surrogates receive compensation, even those few who were refusing it. They encouraged those women to donate the money to charity, for example, but to take the compensation, or to place the money in an account in their children's names for the future. The psychologist who works with this agency let me know that the rationale behind that was that money is an important marker of gratitude, as a thank you gift from the IPs, and that if surrogates didn't take the money, that they would at some point be disappointed, right? Be disappointed with their IPs, and therefore with their journey, and that could actually cause problems. So compensation, therefore, is a really essential part of surrogacy in the United States. It ensures that women are able to become surrogates, and it helps to create a reciprocal rather than a unidirectional relationship, which enables the smooth functioning of surrogacy arrangements. So, as might be obvious in my research, surrogacy is a pretty contentious, politicized issue. Surrogates are aware of this. The women I spoke to are really aware of this, and were careful to frame their labor in a positive light. So compensation is, and perhaps you might be uncomfortable at this moment, as I am just a little bit, right? Talking in the open about compensation, right? Compensation is by far the most delicate topic. And the framing of surrogacy as work rests on talking about compensation. So to acknowledge surrogacy as work, we also have to acknowledge compensation. The concept of reproductive labor here, it's a sociological concept called reproductive labor, I think is really helpful here. So please bear with me for a moment as I make a connection between surrogacy and reproductive labor. There's been a ton of work that's been done on this concept by one of the anthropologists who has done work on this. Her name is Michela Di Leonardo. And she has shown that feminist scholars use the term to capture and make visible, quote, women's non-market activities, housework, childcare, the servicing of men, and the care of the elderly, and to define all of those activities as labor. So when people care for their children in their home, when they do laundry, when they organize a family birthday party, they are engaging in what sociologists call reproductive labor. The flip side of this is productive labor. Many of you might remember your marks from college, right? Productive labor is when people, when people put together our iPhones in a factory. They are producing a product. They are involved in productive labor. Or when they check people out at Walmart, right? They are producing a service, producing a product. Many scholars today use the term care work rather than reproductive labor, and have added relational aspects to this, so hands-on care in order to more fully understand this kind of work. So today we outsource a lot of reproductive labor in this country, caring for children, caring for the sick, caring for the elderly, laundry, food preparation. We pay others to do these things, often so we ourselves can engage in productive labor. We can work. So whole markets have grown up around care work, around reproductive labor. Though there is some variation in how scholars conceptualize care work and think about care work, and some debate about which occupation should be included when we're talking about care work. Interestingly, the gestation and birth of children is often not included. The laboring activities listed by many scholars center on the care of already born people. So I argue in the book that the work of human reproduction, of gestating and birthing children, should be seen as a kind of reproductive labor, as a kind of care work, inasmuch as gestating and birthing children is care of children, right? And of embryos and of fetuses. Part of the social reproduction of families, and an essential activity for ongoing human existence. So world overpopulation aside, we need people to be born. Right? We as a species need more of us. And in the 21st century America, the gestation and birth of children can take considerable mental, physical, and emotional effort. In other words, I am arguing that pregnancy, gestation, and birth are work, regardless of who is engaging in it. Whether you are gestating and birthing your own baby, or you are gestating and birthing a baby for someone else, I argue that is work. So let me explain why I think reproductive labor is care work, or care work is helpful when thinking about surrogacy. So there's been a lot of academic research on reproductive labor to show that reproductive labor is devalued in our society, that it's not seen as quote-unquote real work. This is evidenced by low wages and by little prestige. So I remember reading in the Washington Post a couple years ago that we pay the average parking lot attendant more than the average daycare worker in this country. Okay? So when I'm lecturing about this with students, I often say, so what does that tell us? What message does that give us about this society? If you were to come from Mars, right, and you were studying U.S. society, and you came upon that fact, right, it would tell you we value our cars more than we value our children, which I actually don't think is the case. Right? So why are things structured like that? Right? So this devaluing of care work is made all the more possible because care work often occurs in settings in the home, right? Or in home-like settings, such as nursing homes, and is therefore often hidden from public view. So wages are kept low because this labor is often framed as not work, right, as not real work, and not as work that requires skill, but as a feminine ability, right, that arises naturally in women. Women are seen to be ideally suited for care work in our society. The caring occupations, teaching, direct hands-on healthcare, childcare, are dominated by women in our society. The notion that women are inherently better at caregiving presupposes the idea that men and women are inherently different. As gender scholars have shown, the idea of essentialized gender differences creates hierarchies of power and privilege. So the gender division of labor disadvantages women in our society, both in the home and in the workplace. So ironically, how we actually as a society get around this, how we allow this to happen, I would argue, is that we infuse it with a rhetoric of love. We infuse it with a rhetoric of sacrifice, of care, right? That enables this inequality to happen. It sustains this inequality. It infuses understandings of what is thought of as women's work. Allowing for low wages, allowing for little prestige, allowing for less than ideal working conditions. So when it comes to caring work, then wages are kept low because the work is meant to be a calling. The work is meant to be done out of love. High wages are seen as representative of non-caring employees. Okay? And when the care is a service, non-caring employees are seen to equate to lower quality service. So isn't this ironic in our society, right? That the less we pay someone, the better their service is supposed to be, right? So in a capitalistic society in which value is designated monetarily, we can fight it all we want, but we live in a capitalistic society that designates value monetarily. Low wages presented in female-dominated occupations are framed as a badge of maternal sacrifice, displaying workers' commitments to care and the way we like to think about that care as genuine, as love. So two sociologists, Paula England and Nancy Folbra, have designated this the care penalty. So just as unpaid work in the home is viewed as unskilled drudgery, right, so too is paid care work of a similar nature. So caring labor is just infused with contradictions, I would argue. It's given lip service as valuable, right, especially by those who need it, yet ultimately seen as unskilled. It is culturally valorized, yet not adequately compensated. Precisely, I would argue, because it is labor that is engaged in largely by women. and is seen as an expression of inherent feminine skills, feminine interests, feminine abilities, work that is hidden because it is female family work. So much of that work, so much of the work that surrogates also engage in is also hidden. So I'm making this comparison between other forms of reproductive labor and surrogacy. Surrogates also frame their work as sacrifice, which really neatly positions surrogacy alongside other forms of female-dominated care labor. Within the current organization of surrogacy in the United States, surrogates' work too is meant to be a labor of love, right? Arising out of their nature, right? Arising out of their womanly skills. Because, of course, while some men have entered other female-dominated occupations, especially older markets of nursing and primary school education, being a surrogate mother is impossible for men. At least so far, right? At least today it is. So because of this, surrogacy is perhaps the most uniquely feminine of all the caring occupations, of all the female-dominated occupations. So the rhetoric that undergirds surrogacy, one of self-sacrifice, one of altruism, is therefore inherently gendered, I would argue, with ideas about women, ideas about reproduction, and it's used to support the surrogacy industry. It's a very familiar narrative in the U.S. Like other care workers, surrogates call on the rhetoric of self-sacrifice and love in framing their labor. However, surrogates also emphasize to me and their families, that they and their families deserve compensation. Right? It's not all sacrifice, right? They deserve compensation, they told me, not only because of the time demands involved, but because of the bodily risks they take and the specialized skills that they bring to the market. And this is something that I think surrogates themselves do not get enough credit for, and we do not have enough discussion with in our society about the specialized skills that surrogates bring to the market. But the intrusion of the market into reproduction that surrogacy represents, the outsourcing of making babies, right, among our most intimate interactions, provokes general anxiety in our culture, and as survey research implies, is repugnant to many. So this anxiety, this cultural anxiety, remember beginning with those basic misconceptions people have about what surrogacy is, there's this general anxiety, and we can really see that in the attention that surrogacy garners in the press and in Hollywood. The number of surrogacy births that we have per year in this country does not garner the amount of fascination that we have and the amount of movies and books and TV shows that focus on surrogacy. So it's really, really fascinating. To neutralize this anxiety, right, the strongest marker of the market, which is compensation, while it's really essential for the market to operate, needs to be obscured. In order for the market to be culturally palatable, in order for general people in the U.S. population to accept surrogacy. But ironically, by disallowing a discourse of surrogacy as work, the tremendous amount of labor that surrogates engage in other words, their sacrifice, is also obscured. Right? We can't have it both ways. The surrogacy market depends upon surrogates, yet ironically, cultural anxieties about the commodification of reproduction and children and those basic misconceptions about surrogacy have resulted in a marketing and a cultural discourse that either largely obscures surrogates' actual labor and their attached compensation, or pathologizes it. So what I ultimately found was that surrogacy is therefore seldom acknowledged as a legitimate and or a culturally sanctioned form of paid employment, even by those engaging in this tremendous amount of labor. I think how we as a society approach surrogacy, how we think about these arrangements, has a tremendous amount to tell us about how we as a society think about women, how we think about reproduction, and how we think about the work of caring for others. I think the obscuring of surrogacy work encourages a framing of surrogacy as low-skilled, as innate rote labor, And as my book shows, that is nowhere near the case. Surrogates engage in a tremendous amount of truly skilled labor. So recognition of that skilled labor would not only acknowledge the skill-based work in which surrogates are engaged in, but might also encourage a discussion of the work of pregnancy and birth more generally. If surrogates are paid for their work to birth children, and if we acknowledge that as work, perhaps all women should receive some benefit, such as paid and substantial maternity leave, right, for doing the same. Greater recognition of surrogacy labor might encourage a discussion of the work of pregnancy and birth more generally, of the infertility industry more specifically, and as ways that society can support all women gestating and birthing children, regardless of their genetic connection to or their intended social parenting of those children. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I enjoyed this. So I'd love to answer any questions you might have or have a discussion on these ideas. Does anyone have any questions for me?
I know when we were in Brussels, not only did we deal with some of the broader sociological misunderstandings of surrogacy, but we dealt with some really intense cultural misunderstandings of surrogacy. I think some of it was informed by some of the horror stories that have happened in countries where women were not adequately represented, did not understand the situations that they were getting into, and were frankly taken advantage of. But is there any branching out of the work that you're doing, or application to address some of these other cultural issues? Because I get so much from your conversation that we're really talking about, and I understand that the women that you were dealing with were surrogates who were represented, who understood what they were getting into, and who were in, who did it of their own free will.
Right.
Do you touch on that aspect in your book at all, about
I
sort
do.
of the other side of that?
Right, I do. And the part in the book where I begin that discussion is, I do a little bit of a comparison between surrogacy in the United States and surrogacy in India, right? In the practice that did exist, right, in India. And I mean, this is part of the heart, I think, of the cultural discussion and social anxiety that we have about surrogacy. And it's something that I still grapple with, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, right? But there is anxiety in the U.S., but also around the globe, of surrogacy as exploitation, right? And kind of as part of that anxiety is compensation as well. Is there a figure that's so high that it would encourage women who wouldn't regularly engage in surrogacy to become a surrogate? And is that dangerous? Is that something we should be concerned about? I don't know, we were talking about this the other day, and it's the same kind of discussion that happens in adoption as well, in international adoption, right? Should we pay people when they relinquish their children, right? Money is made, right, in adoption. It very rarely goes back to the communities in which the children came from, right? And the idea being that concern in adoption as well is that that children are being taken from their families because of the money that supposedly might come, right, or small finder's fees that people get. So it's I see it as quite similar. You might get the idea that I really like comparisons. I do comparative work a lot, but I think it centers on this idea of why people make decisions, right? And I don't know. I still grapple with this. Yeah.
I think that goes back to the things we discussed. That the discomfort we see in Europe a lot of times has to do not just with the surrogates, but also with the providers, with the clinics that are all commercial. Many times talk about the fact that they are against commercial surrogacy as much as talk about the fact that they're against compensated surrogacy. Many times it's considered synonymous. So using some of the concept, very helpful concept you introduced, I would say that it has to do with the discomfort of the expansion of markets into areas of life where they shouldn't belong. Mm-hmm. So, and you mentioned that oftentimes it has to do with, occupations or tasks performed by women. Mm-hmm. But just as a way of comparison, I was introducing the comparison to another labor of valor, if you may, not necessarily care, as soldiers. As we could all agree that we have some discomfort about the fact that we pay people to go and die for us. Okay, we pay people to go create life for us, but we also pay people. The markets have invaded that type of work, and it is certainly work. So I would argue that if soldiers were paid $1 million, we could see that on the one hand maybe they're getting better pay, but people who don't belong on the battlefield would be, tempted to go and would be killed more easily, or people are not suited to that, or people that are not motivated, they're not patriotic enough, they're not, brave enough to go and do that. So I think that comparison helps me understand why I feel discomfort with the fact that women might be who are not capable of feeling this motivation. Maybe the motivation, chronologically happened a little different, but women that are not at some point able to feel the motivation of the sacrifice and the care and the love don't belong in this. And if you pay them too much, maybe women who cannot possibly feel that kind of care and will come into this.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate here. Why don't those women belong?
Because they might have psychological trauma afterwards. They could come from families where they might be ostracized later. They may be women who don't enjoy pregnancy and labor. They may be women who cannot feel the empathy that surrogates feel.
Which is why I think those are job qualifications. If we're going to structure it as work, which is a conversation I have a lot, actually, so I really appreciate it. But I think this is why we have psychological evaluations, why we have medical evaluations, because not everybody is cut out for this job. Let's call it a job for the moment. But if you have a robust psychological evaluation and interview, I think you weed that out. I know that we as an agency have people apply who you cringe a little bit and you're like, I don't think you're organized enough. I don't think that you're compassionate enough, because it does require a lot of emotional strength to go through this process. And I think all of those are qualifications, and that's how I think you weed out people. And I'm uncomfortable too when agencies lead with make $60,000 and be a surrogate. It makes me, I get a little I don't want to be dangling it out as a carrot, but it is a reality that we do have compensation. And the comparison that I made when I'm talking about surrogacy as work, and I know it makes lots of people uncomfortable, so I'm careful about language too, but my husband's a firefighter. He has a severely increased risk of cancer. He risked his life every day. He's almost died on the job, and he's paid well for that, and he loves his job, and he accepts that risk, and he puts a lot of passion into it, but it's okay. Like, you can have all of those things at once and put a monetary value on it.
Yes, they can coexist. I mean, I love my job. I would not do it if I didn't get paid, right? It doesn't mean that I love my job any less, right? Or that I think I might be good at it, right?
Well, I guess that's kind of interesting what we're talking about. Obviously you guys are kind of sort of roundabout referencing sort of the puppy bill, Vice hit piece that you see for the India thing that sort of caused some outrage. But, at least in my experience, that doesn't, you're kind of talking about is compensation high enough to draw surrogates in. I think in the U.S. we're kind of close to that, that reality. Like that puppy mill thing doesn't really exist here. At least in my experience, it's not, you can't just go out and pay somebody to live in a dormitory for 9 months in the U.S. at all. So we're way kind of past that whole, but that hit piece still reflects badly kind of on the whole industry. Like the whole industry is sort of drugged down in the mud, which causes a lot of,
Can you draw any parallels to what's going on in third-party reproduction with egg donation right now? Because that whole area of compensation is a whole different story. SART, Society of Assisted Reproductive Technology, said these are recommended levels of compensation, so there's not
Right.
exploitation and so forth.
Right.
Yet there's, I don't know if you're aware, the recent class action lawsuits
Yes.
by the egg donors that are saying, why should you limit our compensation?
Right.
Kind of thing.
I think also that, in conjunction with that, the IRS also said, hey, this is income.
Right.
Which is
Right.
a whole nother, thing. So you got one thing that's income, and then you got this other thing that's kind of, it's very similar,
Right.
related, and it's not. So.
Right, and I think that's very interesting too.
Yeah, right.
When you do some comparative work between egg donation and sperm donation. How they're structured, how people are recruited, it's very different. I'll give a little plug for one of my colleagues, Renee Ameling. She has a book called Sex Cells, and it's CELLS. It's a very cute title that she does. Right, but it's a comparative work between sperm donation and egg donation. Yeah, it's quite interesting because a lot of the same rhetoric is used for egg donors as are used for surrogates themselves, this idea of sacrifice. But also, like, I often like to think about and compare the decisions women make to become egg donors with the decisions young women, because most egg donors who are recruited are young women. The decisions young women have and the difficulty that they have in having elective sterilization, deciding that they do not want to reproduce and want to seek a surgical route to that, and the trouble that young women have, right? Because part of the story about egg donation is this fear, I think, that we as a society have, well, perhaps not us, but society might have, right? That young women really don't know their mind. They really don't understand what they're doing, and that a high compensation level will draw women in who might not have the right motivation, and then later on in life they'll regret it, they'll be concerned, they'll cause problems, right? And so again, I think it has to do with how we as a society especially understand women, right? And the decisions that women make, and the understandings that they have about their choices, and the trust that we have in them. Yeah, I mean, most of the surrogates in my study said, we're very interested in compensation, and some of them negotiated their compensation fee or went to a different agency if they were an experienced surrogate because of compensation or the compensation package they received. But most of them said, I didn't start with compensation, right? I came because of other motivations to this. And you couldn't, if I didn't have those motivations, you couldn't pay me $1 million to do this, right? And if I see, my friends who say they want to do this, and I can tell that they're not in the right frame of mind, or that this would not be what they should be doing, I counsel them, right? And tell them, you have to have you have to be on the right track to do this, the right motivation, the right idea. But it's very interesting, There's real overlaps between egg donation and surrogacy, but there's quite a few differences as well. And it's interesting, perhaps some of you have had these experiences. I did have a couple women in my study who first worked as egg donors, or first donated their eggs, right? And then went on to be surrogates. And they spoke about the differences in those experiences and why they wanted to become a surrogate. But I do want to play devil's advocate.
So what did you say?
Yes, I do for a moment. Because I had a couple women in my study who played devil's advocate with me. And they said, some of them said, through working as a surrogate, and I had some women in my study who'd been on 5 journeys over the course of 17, 18 years. I mean, real experienced women, and then I had some women who, they were brand new, right? So I had a real range. But especially the women who had done quite a few journeys. Some of them said to me, when talking about compensation and talking about surrogacy as work, they said to me, what would be wrong? What would be wrong about thinking about this as a job? And what would be wrong if you didn't if you didn't see this as a sacrifice, but you took all your meds on time, you went to all of your appointments, you were available for your IPs, you had a good working relationship with them, you did all of the work, right, that you were supposed to do, but you thought about it differently. You thought about it as a job, right? And they really pushed me on it, and they said, what would be wrong with that?
And
Yeah.
I think the answer is, has to do with the other way of looking at the care penalty. If instead of looking at it as a care penalty, you say there are people in certain occupations or types of work where part of the compensation is altruistic reward. They're willing to do it for less. So, it's the
Yeah.
flip side of that.
Yeah.
So you're saying if other things being equal, if you have a potential nanny, one of which part of the compensation she will feel genuinely is taking care of a child. The other one, she will just do it for the money. You'd assume as long as the money is the same, one of them will be more motivated than the other. One of them will be motivated by the money plus the compassion. The other one will just be motivated by the money. That means saying, unless you're paying them differently, one of them will be more motivated than the other. That's it. So the answer to that question is what is wrong? What's wrong is that you're probably going to be less motivated. The other one is that there are probably some qualitative, not quantitative differences. Some aspects of what surrogates do, no man in the world, regardless of how much they enjoy, the skin and the hair, during pregnancy or whatever, there's no, that's what I heard, people say that there's as much as they enjoy that, there's some aspects, and correct me if I'm wrong, that no amount of money can compensate, for which you need to have that additional motivation.
And there's also, there's sort of I'm looking at it sort of from the outside, obviously I'm not a surrogate, never will be, but, sort of this obfuscating the language about work, not work, there are some monetary benefits, because if it's work, then it's 1099 income that they get, and that changes the whole profile, that, that whatever that money is, the government comes in and takes a pretty big chunk. So if it's a sacrifice, that's, so there is a monetary value that's sort of associated with downplaying.
Yes, that it's not work.
Yeah.
That's true. Yeah. But also, playing devil's advocate a little bit more, that's a little bit like Google putting out free food all day, right? And saying, stay and work harder because of this, right, yeah. And that kind of, we'll create an atmosphere. Like I remember someone that I knew worked at a corporation that had someone whose full-time job was the party person, that if it was your birthday, they got the card and everyone signed it, right? And they got the cake and they put confetti on your desk and everyone, they gathered up. It was a full-time job.
So how do you feel about that?
Crazy. I know, wouldn't that be fun? Wouldn't that be fun? And it was wonderful. It was wonderful for the people who worked there, but it was a it was a strategy.
But how do you feel about that?
Right.
If I get a card that everybody in the office signed, I feel good. Then a minute later, I would find out that this is the outcome of the new person that was hired. I would feel less good about that. I would not feel that card is as meaningful.
I'm not sure as if everyone in the company as a whole would feel that way, because it's just the atmosphere of fun.
If I thought that person would not get their bonus if they didn't get every single signature, then I would know that those signatures were not genuine.
I don't know. I'm not sure.
It's 80-20, they're just trying to keep 80% of people happy. You're the outlier.
That's right. And what those new types of marketing strategies, those new practices have shown is that it increases production. Right? People stay longer, they work more hours at a company that they like, that they feel like they're surrounded by friends, that company cares about them, even if they know that the company is paying someone to get everyone to sign the card.
Something we talked about earlier, our little panel discussion was gifts. You just brought it up briefly, but when we're talking to IPs, we say, it makes a big difference. If you give a little gift every month, it makes your surrogate just feel a lot better, like you care about her. And like little, I'm talking like send her a candy bar, like nothing big, just like I'm thinking about you right now. But would it be less valuable to the surrogate if they knew we were saying, hey IP, you need to go send a gift right now because it'll make her feel better.
Right.
Is that a false construction of
I
value?
think a secretary to do that for
Right. There's all these things that make you feel more valuable, but sometimes they are, marketing or compensation structures.
But they still feel good.
Yeah. I still like the candy bar.
Yeah.
Can I circle back to the to the premise of what you were talking about, the women who were playing devil's advocate with
Uh-huh.
you, saying that, but why can't we call it a job?
Right.
Were those women specifically, I get the feeling that there's a distinction between just the name that they give themselves in that role and their motivation for it.
Right.
Because I think what you were bringing up is if it is a job, then it means that there can't be that motivation. But what I think you were talking about, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that they were just saying, this is the way that I choose to look at it.
Right.
I still have that motivation,
Yes.
and I don't know what percentage, I'm sure it was a spectrum of the 30 women that you worked with, were much more motivated, from the compensation end, or much more motivated from the sort of altruism.
Right, right. Well, and what was interesting to me about those few women who did say that to me is they were really grounded in the practice. They had, been in surrogacy for a long time. They felt very comfortable, and they felt comfortable talking back. Not literally talking back, but like looking back and reflecting upon the practice. And they were arguing what would be so scary about that. What would be so frightening about that? Because many of them told me, and I could see it from interviewing brand new surrogates to interviewing people who had been in this for a while. Sometimes even there's such anxiety about this, I feel, and it so structures how surrogacy is practiced that there's a dare I say it, a pressure, right, to to use certain framings, right? Now, I'm not saying that in and of itself kind of rules out the fact that people genuinely feel that, right? I mean, most of the women in my studies, said, as maybe you have heard as well, or maybe you have experienced as well, that the initial seed was that they had someone in their lives that experienced infertility, right? Or they themselves experienced infertility. They were introduced to this world and saw how difficult and painful it can be for people, and wanted started to do research on it. Their sister asked them if they would be a surrogate for her because she was having problems. And then a couple doses of Clomid worked for her fine, right? But they'd already done all of this research and saw that this is something that they would be interested in engaging in. So those women themselves who said that to me had those same motivations, right? But they were, and they actually did. They actually stopped me in my tracks when I spoke with them, because they said, "What would be so dangerous about that?" There is a real fear about that centers on motivations. There's concerns about motivations. I mean, I was saying this yesterday. If we truly think this is an ethical practice, and that people are engaging in it ethically, why should we be concerned about motivations? Why should we, for example, if an agency caps the number of times a person can be a surrogate, if they cap that because of concerns about people's health, that's one thing. But what I found were agencies capping it, not because of concerns about health, but capping it out of concerns of motivation, right? That if she did 3 times or 4 times, we would begin to be concerned about why is she really doing this, right? And that interested me. You trusted her on the second journey.
Right.
What's different about the
magical
fourth?
number, yeah.
Right. Right? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, that's interesting because it also brings into my mind the relationship that the intended parents may have, continuing relationship with that carrier who's given,
Sure.
who's helped so many people.
Right.
Will the quality of that change, and with the expectations of the parents as well as the surrogates for the ongoing relationship after the child as well.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I heard those concerns from some intended
You feel
parents.
less special.
Yeah.
And some surrogates said to me, who had done 1 or 2 journeys for a set of intended parents, and then weren't doing a journey with someone else. I thought, I feel like I'm cheating on them, because I do have this special relationship with them. So I think there's concerns on surrogate side as well, how intended parents would understand that. Yeah.